The current tragedy unfolding in where ancient Semitic people are besieged and massacred bears the brutal hallmark of hypocrisy.
A desperate scene at a hospital in where multiple wounded children are being treated. It's after an Israeli attack on a refugee camp. The offensive continuing despite a UN Security Council resolution demanding an immediate ceasefire.
Those who champion human rights on the world stage have become the perpetrators of violence against the defenseless. This isn't a singular anomaly. It's part of a long-standing pattern where Western powers, under the guise of moral superiority, have waged wars to subdue indigenous populations for their own supremacy. Not long ago, the British forces ruthlessly descended upon the native Tibetans, whose only crime was to occupy lands desired by their would-be colonizers. Just as they sought to dominate the Himalayan frontier, so too does this cycle of oppression continue wherever power interests see fit. The year was 1903, and the British Empire, ever suspicious of Russian alliances in Central Asia, turned its imperial gaze to Tibet, a place largely cut off from the rest of the world. What began as a mission to safeguard trade and contain perceived threats would soon become one of the most brutal, bloody, and misguided military invasions of the British colonial era. The British Empire, eager to tighten its grip on Asia, was haunted by the potential of Russian influence in the region, particularly a possible Russian-Tibetan alliance. To the British, such an alliance could become a formidable barrier, preventing them from further colonizing Asia. Their fear was not just of losing control, but of the Russians joining forces with Tibet to thwart British ambitions in the region. India at the time, with a population of 300 million, was subjugated by just 100,000 British officials, a staggering ratio of one ruler for every 3,000 Indians. In the fall of 1903, Lord Curzon, the British Viceroy of India, a white British aristocrat who served as the ruler of India from 1899 to 1905, dispatched Colonel Francis Younghusband with a group of Indian soldiers to lead an expedition into the heart of Tibet. The official reason was to secure British trade routes, but the real reason was to eliminate any potential Russian influence before it could take hold. Francis Younghusband was a British Army officer born to a British family in India in 1863, whose early career was marked by daring journeys across Central Asia. He crossed the Gobi Desert to the region known as Chinese Turkestan, now called Xinjiang, an autonomous region in northwest China. Younghusband was honored and elected as the youngest member of the Royal Geographical Society. Claiming the need to protect British India from imagined threats, the British accused Tibet of conspiring with the Tsar's empire. Francis Younghusband commanded a force largely composed of Indian soldiers, Gurkhas, Sikhs, and Punjabis, subjugated under British rule. With around 3,000 troops, Younghusband searched for a pretext to enter Tibet, and discovered one when some Tibetan yaks drifted over the Indian-Tibetan border. He branded the incident a Tibetan hostility, and in August 1903, he declared war on the country. As Younghusband's forces advanced into Tibet, the encounter at Guru in March 1904 became a moment of grotesque slaughter. The British soldiers, armed with Maxim machine guns, the latest in military technology, faced a Tibetan force largely composed of monks, farmers, and soldiers wielding swords, spears, and outdated flintlock rifles. The Tibetans, many of them believing in the protection of their religious leaders and prayers, charged headlong into a British barrage. The result was a massacre. Over 600 Tibetan fighters were cut down in minutes, their bodies littering the battlefield as the British guns did their terrible work. It was not a battle, it was an execution. Perhaps one of the most heartbreaking elements of the invasion was the spiritual conviction of the Tibetan defenders. Deeply rooted in their Buddhist faith, many believed they were invulnerable to British bullets, shielded by divine blessings. The monks, armed only with religious conviction, charging into machine gun fire was as tragic as it was futile. Their bravery stood in stark contrast to the cold efficiency of British military technology. But in the end, faith alone was not enough to stop the bloodshed. By August 1904, the British forces reached Lhasa, the sacred heart of Tibetan Buddhism. The city, long closed to foreigners, now lay defenseless. The 13th Dalai Lama had fled, leaving the British to impose their will on the capital. What followed next was a British systematic looting of the city's treasures. British soldiers ransacked monasteries and sacred sites, seizing priceless religious artifacts, including golden statues, religious manuscripts, and relics which were sent back to Britain. The holy city was violated by imperial greed, leaving Tibet's spiritual and cultural heritage in ruins. Some of these stolen treasures still remain in British museums to this day, a haunting reminder of the invasion's cruelty. The final insult came with the signing of the Treaty of Lhasa in September 1904. This humiliating agreement imposed harsh terms on the Tibetan government. They were forced to pay a massive indemnity, crippling their economy for decades. The British invasion of foreign territories often culminated in the absurdity of imposing heavy indemnities on the very people they subjugated, forcing them to finance the devastation inflicted upon their own lands. A brutal irony of colonial power, where conquerors demand reparations from those they have oppressed. British trade routes were opened, but Tibet had no say in the matter. The country had been crushed by a power far greater than its own, left to submit to foreign demands while its spiritual leader remained in exile. Ironically, the man who led the violent invasion, Colonel Francis Younghusband, underwent a dramatic personal transformation. After orchestrating the bloodshed and destruction, he became deeply fascinated with Tibetan mysticism and spirituality. In the aftermath of the invasion, he spoke of a spiritual awakening, promoting the idea of a mystical union between East and West. So-called spiritual awakening is a blatant falsehood, a familiar tactic used by colonizers worldwide to mask the brutality of their actions. After orchestrating massacres, they conveniently adopt and romanticize the very cultures they sought to suppress, claiming unity while leaving devastation in their wake. This bizarre shift in his views did little to undo the horrors he had unleashed, but remains one of the most paradoxical legacies of the invasion. The man who had conquered Tibet had become entranced by its spiritual power, but at the cost of Tibetan suffering. While the invasion satisfied Curzon's ambitions, it embarrassed the British government. The atrocities committed by British troops, particularly at Guru, and the needless destruction of Tibetan culture shocked even the evil colonial establishment. Reports of the slaughter reached London, and the public outcry was immediate. Prime Minister Arthur Balfour's government was forced to distance itself from the invasion, acknowledging that the threat of Russian influence had been grossly exaggerated. The invasion was not only a military disaster for Tibet, but a political one for Britain. The most shocking realization of all came after the massacre of the native people. There had been no Russian presence in Tibet at all. The invasion, the massacre, and the destruction had all been for nothing. The Russians had shown little interest in Tibet, and British fears had been nothing more than the product of imperial paranoia. Tibet had been invaded, its people slaughtered, and its culture looted based on a threat that never existed. In the years that followed, Tibet remained under British influence. The invasion marked the beginning of a shift in the region's future. China, emboldened by the victory of the Communist Party in 1949, emerged as a protector determined to shield its people and region from further foreign exploitation after enduring the century of humiliation. By 1950, China took control of Tibet, with the entry of the People's Liberation Army seeking to unify and stabilize a region left politically vulnerable and economically weakened by Western invasions and pillages. It's important to note that while Tibet has had historical ties and periods of influence by various Chinese dynasties, it also experienced stretches of autonomy, especially during times when China's central authority was weakened. This autonomy allowed Tibet to develop its own distinct governance and cultural identity. The region's modern integration into the People's Republic of China is a culmination of these complex historical relationships, marked by phases of connection, separation, and re-engagement over centuries. Understanding China's complex history is essential to fully grasp the context and nuances surrounding Tibet's place within China today. The massacre of indigenous peoples, whether in Asia, Africa, or the Middle East, is a grim legacy, a signature left by centuries of Western imperialism. To truly move forward and unlock humanity's full potential, we must confront and dismantle this legacy of violence. No civilization can ever flourish while it denies others their fundamental humanity. No civilization, empire, or government has ever retained power indefinitely. The Western imperial powers, especially the United States, have long benefited from centuries of exploitation and conflict worldwide, but will eventually lose their dominance. To build a better future, humanity must unite and reject racial and cultural supremacy. Let us know in the comments if you believe Western powers will ever end the cycle of violence.